Hello, and welcome now as we come to the beginning of a new church year, this first Sunday of Advent, a year in which in a special way we will be guided by the gospel writer Matthew. Now the readings assigned for this week, first reading comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, from the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 13, verses 11 through 14, and from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 37 through 44. Now we are engaged now, this time, in the season of Advent. Advent, we know, began as an observance within the Christian church sometime in the 4th century, as a preparation, interestingly, for the Feast of Epiphany, and not in anticipation of Christmas. Epiphany, we know, celebrates the full manifestation of Jesus and is remembered by the visit of the Magi and the baptism of Jesus. So at this time, that is, at the baptism of Jesus, new Christians were baptized and received into the faith. And so the early church instituted a 40-day season of fasting and repentance. Then in the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great was the first to associate the season of Advent with the coming of Christ. Originally, it was not the coming of the Christ child that was anticipated, but rather the second coming of Jesus. And by the Middle Ages, then, the church had extended the celebration of Advent to the more familiar pattern that we know today. And so the early weeks of preparing to celebrate the birth of Jesus, the 4 weeks of Advent, are also given over to the prophet Isaiah. So all of that's a little background for the season that we are celebrating this year. The season of Advent does go a full 4 weeks in preparation for the Christmas observance. A little bit of background on the Gospel of Matthew. In our tradition, it is known as the first Gospel, but that has its own story, because really we do understand that the first Gospel of the 4 was written by Mark. The Gospel of Matthew is written sometime in the 80s of the Common Time, and is a gospel that is particularly familiar with and loaded with Jewish thoughts and understandings, which leads us to the conclusion that the audience of this gospel were Christian Jews, although some might turn it around a little bit and say, were these Jewish Christians? You see, after the fall of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70, as we've mentioned so often, and it is somewhat still a background for the gospel today, a need on the part of the Jewish community to revamp itself after the destruction of its holy place took place. And there was in the city of Jamnia, which is located close to the Mediterranean Sea, a gathering of Jewish leaders, generally today recognized as Pharisees, who saw the importance of pulling Judaism together again perhaps in a different way or a more original way. They remembered that Judaism had been founded on the covenant made with Israel at Mount Sinai under the leadership of Moses, and that it didn't necessarily need a holy city to be its center, but rather it would be centered around the community and around the covenant arrangement. But different understandings of Judaism now emerged, and what we can sense is that one of them was that Judaism found its Messiah in Jesus, and so therefore, in this gospel, as we will hear throughout the year, on certain occasions, there tends to be a tension between the Jewish community, that is, those centered in the teaching of the Pharisee movement, and the Christians, those who tended to center Judaism in the presence and person of Jesus. And so we need to be careful here that that tension should not be interpreted as anti-Judaism, but rather as things were emerging. Now keep in mind, 70, now we're writing this gospel 15 or 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem, that this tension had increased. And in fact, with the fall of Jerusalem, the leadership that had been in Jerusalem moved north into the Galilee. And so that there were many fellow Jews living in the Galilee at the time in which this gospel was written. But we do believe that the gospel was probably written somewhere around the city of Antioch, which would be in Syria, in Lebanon. So it was not in the Holy Land itself that its origin takes place. So again, important to keep this in mind, although some suggest that perhaps some of the tension in this gospel is actually within the community of Matthew itself, that there were some fellow Hebrew Christians who had certain tensions, because we will notice that Matthew is also aware of the fact that becoming part of the Christian community incorporated others who were not Jewish, namely Gentiles. And we will see this a little bit, as I say, as the year unfolds. But all of this might be important because, as I've tried to do throughout these talks, is at times the section used for the gospel may not be completely consistent with the whole unfolding of the particular gospel that we're looking at, in this case, the gospel tradition of Matthew. And in fact, one of the characteristics that is going to be very important in this gospel is that as Moses certainly is the centering person of Judaism in the years gone by, particularly what we would call the Old Testament or the non-scriptural times, if Moses is the center for the Old Testament, then for the Christian, Jesus is the center for the Christian movement, and often the writer will make comparisons between Moses of old and Jesus as the new Moses, as the new leader, as the new Savior, as the Messiah. So keep in mind as we look at things how frequently those Jewish connections are made, because both sides, if you want, or both parties are very familiar with the tradition. With that in mind, let's look for a moment at the section that is used this time for our consideration on this first Sunday of Advent, which, going back a moment to a point that I made in the introduction, looks not to the coming of Jesus historically the first time as the child at Bethlehem, but rather still looks to another coming, to a coming of Jesus in glory at some time in the future. And that's where this particular little section now, chapter 24, one might notice that earlier in this chapter, we are picking up at 37, so there is some parts missing here, in which Jesus again had talked about the fact that the city of Jerusalem would see a demise and would not be there. And the question that emerges then on the part of the audience that is listening to Jesus' words is, when is this going to happen? And carefully, the answer is not given. The basic message of this time for the section that we hear is, stay awake, therefore, says the gospel writer, "for you do not know the day your Lord is coming." So keep in mind that that's the idea, that there will be a coming of the Lord. And the picture of Jesus is that there is a general need for watchfulness, constant vigilance. Can't give up on this. Now, why might this be a case? Because by the time that we're looking, say in the 80s, that is some 50 years after Jesus' time, if the expectation of the early Christians was that Jesus would be coming again in glory shortly, that had not happened. And were there those who were beginning to sense, you can even get a little bit of this in the writings of Paul, who had written in the 50s and early 60s, that might be occurring. There needed to be some kind of assurance that although this coming of Jesus immediately, that had been the expectation perhaps of the early Christians, did not happen when they expected, but that the coming of Jesus in glory was still going to occur. And so one of the perhaps points of this little section of the gospel is a reassurance that Jesus will indeed be coming in glory. Now, the illustrations that are used in the second section of chapter 24 are interesting. Some call these three little parables, although they perhaps might be better as just three little stories that help what? The community be sensitive to the fact of staying alert or staying awake, and I think that's often one of the messages that is intended on this first Sunday of the Advent season. Verse 37 speaks of the days of Noah and the coming of the Son of Man. Now, in this case, certainly we know the story of Noah, which comes from the book of Genesis, but here there's no reason given why the flood happened, only that when the flood happened, it came unexpectedly, that those who were kind of watching, we can kind of even picture Noah building his ark wherever it was, but apparently it wasn't near any body of water. People, did they just notice it, but paid no attention to it? So that when the floodwaters began, they were caught off guard. Indeed, it came unexpectedly. And that, of course, I think is perhaps the point of this little parable that is included. The next says that when the unexpected happens, a way of life will be affected. Two men will be in a field, or two women will be at the mill. Of course, you get a division of labor here. Men do the field work, women do the milling. You have to smile a little bit there. They are doing the same tasks. You know, they both have to do with grain making, but it will happen unexpectedly. See, again, the importance that if we're going to prepare for it, it isn't that we need signs or something that's going to tell us, oh, this is going to happen. No, that's not the way in which it will happen. Therefore, verse 42 continues in the section that we hear the importance of watchfulness. Stay alert. And verse 44, which kind of brings us to the conclusion of the section that we're looking at, is that we treat every moment as if it were the moment of the Son of Man's coming. Well, that is perhaps a simple message that we're made aware of when we hear this section on the first Sunday of Advent. See, we're really in chapter 24, coming to the end of Matthew's Gospel. This is the section. There is just one more section after this, as chapter 25 begins, in which you have the famous last judgment scene that is exclusive to Matthew, which we will only see at the end of the Matthean year. So you have to wait till Christ the King feast next year, 23, to kind of hear that part of the gospel. So you see, we really take the gospel here to shape it to the celebrations that we are attending to. So that will be who our guide is, the guide of Matthew. A word about the prophet Isaiah, who is perhaps one of the most popular of prophets in Christian literature. We hear many readings from the prophet Isaiah throughout the year, and we will hear readings from the prophet Isaiah even as we enter into the Advent season. Prophets, however, and it's important perhaps to remember this, that prophets were chiefly spokespersons for the will of God in their contemporary time and place. We should not think of the biblical prophets as looking to the future, as crystal ball gazers, as it were, as sometimes we tend to associate prophets or prophecy with. Rather, the prophets were those who spoke God's intentions for the here and now. And so when we study Isaiah, who we believe, by the way, which is the longest, I may have mentioned this book in the collection of prophets, had 3 different sections. The reading that we hear this time comes from section 1, which would be the first 39 chapters of the book, which would have been written before, we believe, the fall of the city of Jerusalem back in the 500s before the common time. So this is the prophet Isaiah, who announces the imminent doom and invasion that will be made by Assyria. Now at this point, Assyria was beginning to assume its control over the Middle East. There will be, as you know, 3 great empires, one always larger than the other. Assyria then would be taken over by Babylon. Babylon would be taken over by Persia. So as the story begins, it's Assyria which is intending to extend its influence. And one of the ways, of course, in which it hoped to do this was to take the city of Jerusalem. The phrase that Isaiah uses, "in the days to come," he points not to an event in the long distant future of his time, but rather to something which he foresaw as imminent, as something which was going to take place. We suspect that already the forces of Assyria were beginning to move against the city of Jerusalem. Now, why would this be important? Because if we mention so often, those of you who are familiar a little bit with the geography of the place know that the land of Israel is kind of the bridge between the 2 great power bases, if you want, of the Middle East, namely Egypt in one place and the Mesopotamian area in the other. Now, to get from Egypt up to the Mesopotamian and vice versa, one of the most logical ways was to go through the land of Israel. And of course, those who controlled Jerusalem controlled important ways of regulating what activities happen between these 2 centers. Now again, all of that's a little bit of background to this prophet named Isaiah. Now he is a prophet of hope because he pictures Zion, which equals Jerusalem here, that will finally become the source of peace for the whole world. It's interesting what the prophet is arguing with for both the leadership and for the ordinary folks. We've mentioned before that prophets were not necessarily found in the courts of the kings, but were often found with the ordinary folk that would put them in the marketplace where most people were. Think about it, shopping in those days was just as important then as it is now. So it's with that in mind that the Christians, now this is important to notice, that what Christians do, Christian thinking, and this is how our liturgy looks at it, is to take the writings of Isaiah and reapply them to Christian understandings. It is true that in the first century of the Common Era, there was relative peace in the ancient world. Now, keep in mind that the ancient world is what we would call the Mediterranean world, and that many who lived in the Mediterranean world were believers who always thought that they could find their answers by looking to the past. So see, here's a way now in which Christian writers and Christian thinking looks to the past and therefore looks to Isaiah and to his saying. So reading first Isaiah in the first century convinced believers that they were living in the time of Israel's, Isaiah's description, rather. Now, when we say that there was peace in the first century world, it was Roman peace. And in fact, we will hear this even as we move closer to the Christmas time, that there was a universal peace. But Roman peace was built, as you remember, on the principles of law and order. And law meant that the Romans tried to extend, and often did, Roman rule law to all of the conquered colonies. By the first century, they had done pretty well in taking the lands surrounding the Mediterranean world, and were beginning to move north, into Europe, but that would take a little bit more time. But law and peace meant that you did it the Roman way. And we've seen this before, that the Roman way was if you didn't do what Rome suggested, then you might pay the price. And so the sword, or pressure of Roman rule, maintained a kind of peace. So is that the background, therefore, in which the Christians could and did read Isaiah? See, so we will hear many sections of this prophet throughout the year. Let me just, while we have a moment, point out, as I mentioned a couple moments ago, that the book of Isaiah is really built into three sections. The first 39 picture a remnant, they call it Daughter Zion. And by the way, Israel, at the time that Isaiah is writing, was not taking Assyrian rule lying down. It was kind of wanted to fight against the Assyrians to prevent things happen. However, the Assyrian army invaded. Now, at the time in which Isaiah lived, the land of Palestine had been divided into two kingdoms, the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. And so the Assyrian army in the early 700s had taken the northern kingdom, and it had collapsed, and they had led many away into exile. And so now was Assyria eyeing the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judea. So all of that, now Isaiah lives through an interesting period of time, and he will also live during the time of the fall of the south under the armies of Babylon. So you see, this is the interplay of power positions in the Middle East. So the first section of Isaiah is the richest and most complex. He has a grand style. He loves to use different imagery. He is magnificent in what we call the metaphorical language, very rhetorical techniques, and he is, however, warning his community that they are living under the possibility of perishing. But nevertheless, even though that may happen, the promise that God will remain faithful. The second section of Isaiah are chapters 40 through 55. These talk about the return of the exiles to Jerusalem and freedom from exile, and probably this section of Isaiah was written during the time of the Persian conqueror, King Cyrus. And then chapters 56 through 66 speak of a new universalism, when all of the world will come to Jerusalem, when all of the world will find peace. So I mentioned that the section, and sometimes during the year we will have to mention, are we looking at 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, or 3rd Isaiah? Only always remembering that the prophet who is speaking is talking to his own people in his own time. And so although we often use Isaiah as predicting the coming of the Messiah, keep in mind that that is a Christian interpretation, using, as we've been speaking today, a viewpoint that somehow the past can give an important window and help to the future. So indeed, Isaiah is both a prophet, that is speaking to his people, but he is also a poet. That when you look in the book in the Bible, you will see that all the writings of Isaiah are in the form of poetry. Now again, if you're a good Hebrew, remember that it's in Hebraic language. We, of course, later on will find translations of Isaiah into the Greek, and of course that's in which we really receive it. So all of that, again, a little bit of background about a prophet who will very much determine many of the readings, not only through the Advent Christmas season, but also throughout the rest of the year. And so once again, we return to the gospel writer of our guide, namely Matthew. Matthew, we will see, just in finishing, at the same time that he is very concerned with Judaism, and I want to reiterate that sometimes when slurs or kind of negative things are said by Jesus or others against the Jews, that this, if I might point this out, could be considered a family struggle. You see, in a family struggle, you know how to irritate a member of the family if you're really mad at them. If you don't know how to do that, don't get in an argument with them. But notice, if you do get in an argument with a family member and you really want to get to them, you say something that you know about them or something that irritates them, and you know that will kind of turn them on and maybe create, well, maybe a healthy discussion, but more often than not, an argument, okay? And that's true, that if you think of the Gospel of Matthew as engaging in a family argument with fellow Jews, they both know the language and the style that will irritate one another. And so therefore, caution here is that the Gospel of Matthew is not anti-Jewish. See, it's not against the Jews or fellow Jews, but it's an irritant that will get them, and hopefully this is all part, by the way, of Hebraic Bible study, to get the other side to talk about things. See, it isn't so much that one side is necessarily going to be right, but rather out of this dialogue can come new understanding. So again, all of that is a little background now as we enter this new season, this season of Advent, where indeed our guide in the first reading will be the famous prophet Isaiah. Stay ready, stay alert, stay watchful is the message of the gospel this time. Thank you, and welcome to the new season.